end, we had Andrew Bray and Emily Sims. Emily is Chief Planning Officer at the Uralla Shire Council. Uralla is in the heart of New England. I visit it several times a year, and let's hear what they had to say. Andrew Bray and Emma Sims, thanks very much for joining this episode of Energy Insiders, where we're going to talk about the regions and social, I'd hate to use that phrase, social license, ever since a professor from Monash University told me it was a colonial term, but generally community attitudes. But to start with, Andrew, can you remind me what you're the CEO of RE Alliance? Could you tell me and our listeners a little bit about RE Alliance?
Sure. RE Alliance, we're the Renewable Energy Alliance. We're a not-for-profit advocacy organisation. We've been around for nearly 13 years now. We work with regional communities who are experiencing the shift to clean energy where they live. So we try to help with those communities with education, with knowledge, try to help them get a bit more on the front foot when it comes to being part of the transition. So that's work that we like to do.
Great. And I think your business, and I'm going to call it a business even though it's not for profit, has been growing. How many people work for RE Alliance now?
We have a team of 10, which is a lot of them are out in the regions. So in Queensland and New South Wales and regional Victoria out there. So on the ground working with communities in those areas, as well as some communication staff and policy as well.
And Emma, I think you're the Senior Strategy Advisor for the Uralla Shire Council. Can you tell me a little bit about your job and a little bit about the Uralla Shire, which is in New England, as I know, because I grew up only about 20 kilometres away.
I think we might have gone to the same school. Did we? Were you in Armidale High School?
No, I went to TAS, which the Armidale School, for my sins.
When it was just boys.
When it was just boys, and we could talk a lot about that, but we won't.
So my name's Emily Sims. I am the Senior Strategic Planner at Uralla Shire Council, and Uralla is a little shire that is kind of nestled between the much larger council areas of Armidale and Tamworth. And it's quite a unique little place. We've got about 6,000 people across the shire, about 3,000 square kilometres. It's part of the New England bioregion, so it sits at quite an elevation. Uralla itself is at over 1,100 metres above sea level on the plateau. Means that we have just the most exquisite climate, in my opinion. Cold winters, springs that spring, summers that never get above 35.
You can see the stars at night. We'll come back to that because the air is clear.
Oh.
Emily, I guess New England's a region where there is expected to be a lot of renewable energy development. In some versions of the integrated system plan, it's actually the area expected to have the most renewable capacity eventually, at least in New South Wales, and I think even in the NEM. At the moment, though, Uralla is a town that has a solar farm, one of the biggest solar farms in Australia. Let me just ask generally, what's the feeling in the region around the costs and benefits to the region, to the people in the Shire about that particular solar farm?
The New England Solar Farm, which is an ACEN owned and operated farm, they're just at stage 1 at the moment. So I think they've only got 450 megawatts installed, but eventually that farm will be 750 megawatts. So making it one of the largest ones in Australia, if not the largest. I think the developer before they sold it to ACEN, set a pretty high standard in the community, and generally speaking, the solar farm is supported. I think the business is supported. I actually wasn't around for the development of stage 1, but I am interested in seeing how the stage 2 construction phase pans out, in part because we have an expectation that there will be additional farms or factories, depending on who you ask, being installed at the same time. So there was definitely a noticeable increase in rents and a drop in rental availability during the construction of the ACEN New England Solar Farm. So that's definitely something that the community is watching very closely, and the council's really attempting to get on the front foot around. Mostly in the New England region, the issue isn't the individual existing pre-res kind of infrastructure. It's concern about the cumulative impact of the anticipated 8 gigawatt size and the new transmission and the multiple energy hubs that are expected to land. And of course, because we're right at the planning phase, we haven't got a consented environmental impact statement for the transmission lines that will enable all of this development. It's really very uncertain how much, when, and what the impacts will be.
That's right. And to just work our way through this, there are so many different perspectives on it, which we won't have time to address all of them today. But how is council approaching the issue? I mean, for instance, down in the Central West Arana zone, there have been a lot of discussions from councils about having a REZ-wide cumulative impacts kind of study. Are the councils in the New England Res all sort of working together themselves, or are they approaching it individually? And what do they see as their role in the process?
So I think the councils in the New England area are really proactive, and I think they have the benefit of New England being we're going last sort of in terms of the development. So we are learning, as are the state agencies such as Energy Co, from the rollout of the Central West Arana Res. And that has meant that New England is kind of able to identify much earlier potential impacts and advocate quite strongly around them. Sam Copeland, who is the current mayor of Armidale, was the founder of a coalition of regional renewable energy mayors, which Urala's mayor, Robert Bell, has been a part of since its inception. And that has been a very, very useful forum for sharing information amongst the mayors across New England, but also across CWO and Southwest Res, etc. And really, there is quite a diversity of political
opinions
in the New England. So, for example, Armidale's council and Urala's council are, I think, aligned in the sense that our job, this is what I think our council sort of has adopted as its operating principle, is that our job is to maximize the opportunities that may come out of this and minimize the impacts of it. We don't need to be for or against it, but we cannot pretend it's not happening.
Yes, I hear all that, and I guess from the council's perspective and from this joint council perspective, what are the issues that they or the concerns, and let me deal with those first, and then that they are paying most attention to?
So, as I mentioned, it's the cumulative impact of multiple projects rolling out at once that are the primary concerns, and the kinds of issues that come with intense population growth for a temporary time, and then the falling away of that population. So we've essentially got a boom population boom followed by a very rapid sort of downturn. And it's that the challenge of managing what happens in terms of property prices and rental availability, like accommodation basically, what happens in terms of the ability of local businesses to scale, what happens to the social fabric in the short term, and then what the ramifications might be in the long term due to that sort of temporary influx. Uralla is particularly, I'm going to say, well positioned to, we're right in the middle. So if you have a look at where the proposed energy infrastructure, the energy hubs in the New England Res are located and where the new transmission will be running, Uralla is kind of like the center of the New England Res. And, you know, when we were first starting to, you know, think about the potential implications of this, it was pretty obvious, you know, for us, it was like, okay, well, Armidale's got a lot of, you know, empty commercial space. Armidale has the urban growth in terms of resi, so, and Tamworth as well. What we didn't know is that there's something called fatigue management, and most of the projects are actually within a 45-kilometre radius of Uralla. So 45 kilometres being this magic threshold of fatigue management for workforces. So what we started to understand recently is that Uralla is actually expected to take the majority of temporary worker growth in the New England Res, which is what that looks like is that our primary township, Uralla, is a town of 2,000 people, and we're expecting another 2,000 people in terms of temporary workforce. So a doubling of the population for a finite period of time, that maybe 10 to 20 years. The planning challenges, like for me as a town planner, the planning challenges of that kind of rapid growth, infrastructure, waste, social fabric, I mentioned, you know, the kind of intangible networks and community cohesion that makes a small town like Uralla have such a strong place identity and such a resilient community. There's a real concern about those things breaking down.
That's right. And I guess when I think about this, I always think about the coal seam gas build out in Queensland, where there must have been, and I wasn't guess so similar kind of population, temporary population, whilst all the coal seam wells were being drilled. Do you know whether you know your council or any of the councils have actually tried to see what happened in Queensland and how they managed with it? Because I mean, in the end, they did.
Yeah, so we're really lucky. One of our councillors is a gentleman called David Mailer. He's actually in the renewable energy game himself. He mostly does small scale solar, I think behind the meter sort of stuff. His wife is from Chinchilla, and he was in the Surat Basin as a lot of that coal seam gas boom rolled out, and he is almost like the I'm going to say
The guru.
He might represent, not so much the guru. I think he's like the you know, that sometimes I think he's probably got more of a reality around the potential impacts. Although I think, given that we haven't had a lot of projects actually start to construct, sometimes I think, the sky's not falling in. What is it? That Chicken Little. He might resent me saying that, but certainly he often brings the Surat Basin into conversations about what might happen.
Could I perhaps jump in on that? I know that even in the Wimmera Southern Mallee down in Western Victoria, that they also organised a trip up to the Surat Basin for that very reason, just to see how it had been done in the past. to make sure they learnt the lessons, build the relationships with the people up there so that they, when they were looking ahead to the amount of construction that they saw coming there, having those connections with other communities who'd been through the same thing just seemed really sensible for them.
Yeah, and I've seen surveys that show that the community has broadly come to terms with the coal seam gas thing, despite the fact that there were all these, and still are probably, stories about water wells catching on fire and everything. I guess it's easy for me to say, and doesn't really relate to the fact that people have a sense of place and a sense of community and a sense of being custodians of the land and that kind but the change is always, any change is difficult, and but after the change sometimes it's easier. I guess that's what makes me optimistic. Do you, Emily, I just wanted to ask, I mean, you get a lot of discussion that Energy Co and developers sort of fly in and fly out and don't really understand or engage properly, or don't really encourage the communities to be the people actually doing the change instead of being the ones forced to accept it. I just wondered, how do you find the level of engagement? And you talk about fatigue for travel, but there's also like engagement fatigue of having to go to too many meetings and stuff like that. I mean, in terms of the organisation and process and procedure of what's going to be a multi-year kind of thing, how would you describe the score at the moment?
In terms of the developers' engagement?
Developer and Energy Co and the transmission line, which is always the most contentious part of it, I think.
Yeah, so look, Uralla Shire has adopted a very proactive approach. We're not going to let the standard, I guess, of engagement from Energy Co or developers be what drives our community's participation. We believe that council has a role to play there. So actually, we've been working with an organisation called the Next Economy and RE Alliance, and really on a project called Striking a New Deal, which has allowed us to do 12 months of proactive community engagement. We've been going into our community and we've been asking, what do you want to see at the end of this development? What are the hills you will die on? What do you absolutely not want to see? Do you understand what's happening? Because, I feel like I'm in a very privileged position because I get to have these chats with Energy Co and the developers all the time. I feel like I understand the scale of what's occurring, but that scale isn't broadly understood in our community. And I think that the council has felt that there is a role for council in helping our community understand the scale of change that we can expect to roll out. And so that process has meant that we now have a pretty clear roadmap in terms of what our community wants to see, what the things that it really values, what it believes to be the biggest opportunities that could come out of the renewable energy rollout, and what are the things that really, really wants to protect. And we will, that is being assembled into like a renewable energy strategic plan for council. And it doesn't just include council actions. It'll be a document that we are able to give to developers, we are able to give to Energy Co and say, these are, you're talking about community benefits. Here is a shopping list of legacy projects that the community's already identified. And that piece of work is actually quite resource intensive and requires a very engaged community. And the fatigue thing is real. There are multiple projects happening. We've got a pipeline of 5 gigawatts of different projects, wind, solar, batteries, transmission, all rolling out. And from the perspective of the average punter on the ground, it doesn't know its squadron from its EDF, from its ASET in Australia. They're all just renewable energy developers.
I love to hear that word, punter. I used to use it so often in investment banking. Sorry, it makes me smile. It brings back very fond memories. But anyway, I completely get it. Look, we'll come back to there, Emily, because I am interested in your assessment of what the overall sentiment is, having done all that work. But let's zoom out a little bit, Andrew, in terms of what your assessment of what the broader regional communities' ownership of the projects and involvement and attitudes towards it is. First of all, is it supportive or not supportive in general, in your opinion? And secondly, how's sentiment, for want of a better word, been changing over the last year or so?
I've been sort of, I guess, watching projects like this for, probably a bit over a decade. And it's not unusual that anytime projects like these go up, that you have a bunch of people over one side of the spectrum, if you like, who are very supportive, and a bunch of people who are very much over the other side of the spectrum who are not supportive. And then you've got the vast sort of quantity of people in the middle who are not terribly engaged, don't care particularly one way or the other, how things roll out. So in that sense, the whole shift to clean energy, and particularly renewable energy zones where you've got a lot of projects clustered together, sort of fit a similar pattern to that. And so the polling that you sometimes see in those renewable energy zone areas, and there's been a few of them come out last year and this year, show that there's actually a pretty strong core of what you might call soft support in the regions. So, despite what the headlines of the Daily Telegraph might say, when people are polled, they will, around 60%, I've seen some as high as 70, some that are perhaps down to 55, of people who will be supportive. The majority of those you would categorize as, say, soft support. They're kind of okay with it happening, but not terribly engaged. But one thing that's, you would probably look at that soft support group and say, well, actually, that support is probably a bit fragile. And the reason that it looks that way is because if you ask people to name, things they're concerned about, things that they might, be worried could go wrong, maybe the workforce might not be there, it might have an impact on accommodation or whatever it is. Those things rattle off the tongue very quickly. But then if you ask them, well, what are the benefits for your community? They sort of scratch their head a bit and, have to really struggle to find out. So they don't necessarily see that it's going to make their community better. And I think that's the gap that we really haven't seen filled. I think that's a government responsibility, frankly, and I don't think they've really stepped into it to the degree that they need to. And I don't think the communities in these areas have been engaged in an effective way, a bit like what Emily was describing a second ago in terms of that quite intensive community engagement, community-centred engagement that they did around Uralla in that Striking a New Deal process. That's the sort of stuff that I think we need to see much more of in regional communities.
And I guess also it surprises me, Andrew, and I just ask your observation on this, but initially when we were building wind farms in South Australia and Victoria, there really wasn't any opposition of, great note. I mean, AGL and what's now Infigen built a lot of wind farms in South Australia, and they would have, offices in town, and you would go in there. And I've visited some of those wind farms, flew over them in a helicopter, and I don't recall really massive community resentment or even difficulty with it. In New England itself, there's Sapphire Wind Farm, which, as far as I know, went ahead. I mean, what's caused? What's changed to make people push back more?
Yeah, again, having been there when a lot of these ones were going up in the start of the 2010s, I can assure you there were there were absolutely people who objected to them. Not in huge numbers, but if you look back to that point, engagement was on the whole a little bit cursory, and even the communities around the projects, and I'm thinking here mostly of wind farm projects, which were the main ones going up then, were not well engaged. There was no sort of consideration of benefit sharing with neighbours, and so that more sort of equitable distribution of benefits, which is par for the course these days. So there were a bunch of reasons why some people got their noses out of joint about it. And so to a certain extent, that's we're in a similar situation now, but we've just got a lot more projects going up, and I think communities are now looking at it and saying, well, this is not just happening over in that corner of my LGA. It's something that's happening all over the LGA, and I want to know what the answers are when it comes to workforce accommodation. I want to know, yeah.
I wish there were a lot of projects going up, but I get the point. And now to come back to your other point about benefits, when I start talking about it, I start to talk about more, people, skilled professionals in town, most temporary, but some permanently. I think about the general GDP multiplier effects that come from investment. If there's 5 gigawatts going into Uralla Shire, that's $15 billion of capital investment, say, for a number, and there has to be some. I think about the income to the landowners where transmission and wind and solar projects will go. I think about the roadworks, the improved roads that will be done. I think about the long-term climate benefits, not that that's something that any individual person is going to get. I think about the improved infrastructure. I think of more skilled workforces, meaning more air flights. I mean, air flights into Armidale are very expensive when you can actually get one at all. I think about, more medical staff coming into the town because there are more people there, so you can actually get an appointment with a doctor. Am I wrong to think about all those things?
No, those benefits are absolutely there. But this again comes back to the question around is the conversation being had with communities? Is it clear that if these projects go ahead, and look, a lot of the discussions for these happen when the projects are in development rather than once they actually sort of go onto the ground and start generating electricity. So they're sort of a bit theoretical. People have questions around things, including what the benefits will be, and there's no a coherent narrative, I would say, out there around what sort of benefits local communities should expect. And so those things those things are just not clear to people, and so they don't have an idea in their head of, okay, we host this infrastructure. There's some things we're worried about with it, but there are also some things we can really get out of this. And so people like Emily, who are in councils all around the country, can see these possibilities. They've got a lot of work to do to make them happen, but we want to see communities brought into that discussion as well.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that, Andy, that there isn't a coherent narrative about what the benefits are. And I would add to that also that benefit isn't a one-size-fits-all type of thing, and what looks like a benefit to one community in one place and one time may not be what another community needs or wants at another time. I mean, we do need basic infrastructure. Certainly there are things like we've identified through the SAND project that people would like to see more health services. Like we really struggle with GPs and health services in the New England region, and if we could get more doctors and more health services as a legacy benefit from the RES, that's something that people identified. Other things like, for example, road upgrades and infrastructure upgrades, that is a benefit that could potentially be realized, absolutely, what we are looking at the moment is some coordination gaps around how road and transport impacts are managed across multiple projects. So I always like to bring it back to this problem that we're trying to solve right now in council, which is that we have an early mover project that needs to open up a TSR. It would be a positive legacy benefit for the entire community if that TSR was turned into public road, because it would provide a link from the New England Highway to
Sorry, TSR for not everyone's in
traveling
the
stock route. Traveling stock route. So this is basically a small section of Crown land, and if it were to be turned into a public thoroughfare, it would mean that we don't have as many cattle trucks coming right through the center of town through residential area. So massive ongoing impact, benefit to the community. The problem is that one project needs to do it at this time scale. They need to form a relationship with Crown Lands. They need to get an approval from the department. They're using a different turbine blade size to the energy code parameters. So, we need to have 4 different developers coordinated to share the costs, to spec the road at the right scale. And really, there is a role there for the council. I mean, if we were a bigger council with, a bigger balance sheet, we'd probably just step in and do it. But because we're such a small council, that is not something that's easy for us. And then the mechanism of actually sharing the cost, it's not. These are things that we're working out, and I often use the phrase that we are building the plane whilst flying the plane.
I think that's normal, to be honest, to some extent. I think it's one step at a time, and hopefully, and this is, in my opinion, this is how you get things better. You learn from the last REZ, and then you learn on the job as well. I don't think that's particularly unusual.
Messy. I'm just going to say to that, because I agree with you, David, but messy iterative processes do not fill the punters with heaps of confidence.
No, I hear that. I hear that. There's execution in the stock market. Companies' management used to be judged on execution. You say you're going to do X, how well do you do it? And that's always the case. Andrew, one of the things that's come up when we talk about community benefits more and more is, actually electricity prices for residents in communities and stuff like that. And I noticed in Queensland, Squadron or Fortescue or one of the Twiggy companies at one of their wind farms is offering lower electricity prices to residents within X kilometres, and that's also happening down in the southwest a little bit. Do you see this as a kind of a trend or anything?
Oh, look, I think it is. It's certainly one of the things we hear very regularly from communities in renewable energy areas when we're out talking to people. If we're going to host all this electricity infrastructure, we should have cheaper power bills. It's a bit of a no-brainer in that sense. It makes sense to everybody. But anyone who knows about electricity markets and distribution and transmission systems knows that it's a horribly complicated area to navigate. And so what we're seeing with those kind of examples, which I think are quite good actually, is that they simply offer bill rebates to people in whatever area is appropriate to that region. And so I think they're to this. I mean, they're sort of new. So I think we're sort of seeing how they'll roll out and what the acceptance in those areas is. But certainly the early indications are that people are quite interested in taking them up, particularly if they don't involve changing retailers. That's a little bit of extra sort of challenge about it that I think some of the schemes are trying to avoid if they can. So there's a few. There'll probably be a few different goes at it in different shapes and sizes, but I think it's a real step forward. And again, it comes back to that thing of if there's an obvious benefit that people can point to and say, well, once that plant went up, solar farm or battery or whatever it is, we started to get cheaper power in this area. So that's something people can really hang their hat on.
I think so, in the sense it's like a personal connection as opposed to, I mean, you like doing stuff, you like seeing the community, you like the doctor, but something that benefits you personally or your household even better in some ways.
I think there's also a sense that it could be a way to ensure that there is ongoing sustainable economic development over a longer period of time. To have we were talking to the mayor of Garawara about this, to have a reindustrialization or ancillary industry that's able to locate in areas where there are benefits in terms of, cheaper power or whatever. I feel like there's a sense that could be a bit of an ongoing. I think one of the fears that we have is that, you talk about $15 billion in investment. Well, that's true, but once they're built, the actual ongoing employment is pretty low in terms of the manpower it takes to operate these facilities.
No, I think that's true, and I think it's without question. But that's not unique. I mean, to the energy industry, and it's not all going to be built in 5 years. I mean, this is still people's careers who will go through this development phase. It's all going to, in my opinion, and there will be ongoing maintenance and stuff like that. But anyway,
there are. I mean, just to round out that idea. I mean, the schemes I was referring to were very much pointed at households, but that's also an aspiration that we hear a bit, particularly in remoter areas. Is if we had cheaper power that could actually underwrite local businesses coming to set up here, and knowing that there was a long-term supply of reasonably priced power, that could actually be an economic driver for those regions that they don't have right now. So, surely we can work that one out as well.
I don't rule it out, but I mean, when you actually look at the history of it, it's only a few really big businesses where power costs are actually the be-all and end-all of everything. There's a lot of other costs like transport and logistics and accommodation and manpower and stuff that make regional business difficult. And, the reality is, when you look at the overall statistics, that in fact the regional share of GDP is I think slipping a little bit on average in Australia, and its share of the population isn't growing either. So this is why I think anything you can do to get something going on and stop regional Australia just being turned into like a tourist town for how Australia used to be is something that we could broadly encourage. But maybe I'm on the wrong track.
It's definitely something that our community has identified as a benefit that it would like to see coming out of the renewable energy zone. Pathways open up for skills and training for young people from the New England. One phenomenon has always been Armidale was an education centre, right? And that's changed a little, but we have a region that's quite an educated population. And I think this sense that if young people in the region can see a way into industries that would otherwise take them to the city, one of our councillors gives the example of he has a guy working for him who, just because of the developments that are happening in Western New South Wales, he is now a leading authority in Australia on a particular best technology, simply because right place, right time, and he's done the training. And I think, I think that if those pathways become, I'd love to think that I have an 18-year-old son, that he could leave school next year, get his head around, helping to plug in a few solar farms, maybe learn how these batteries work, and then take that around the world and he wants to go into IT. So, you know,
I think it'll be the other way around, Emily. Your hopes are going to be dashed. He's going to go around the world, and then he might eventually come back. That's your best hope. That's my opinion.
I think that would be what he would prefer as well. But in terms of, career opportunities beyond, needing to go to the city to train, I guess what I'm saying is that is something that not just I as a mother in the New England aspire to, but that's something that our community would like to see more young people staying in the region.
I agree with that, and I do think you need diversity of income, diversity of jobs, and stuff like that. Without spending too much time on New England specifically, the university might be able to put an engineering school in. It might be able to have a different psychology wing to deal with identity and community relations theory. And I'm quite serious. I mean, these are important topics. Look, we're running out of our end of our time today, and I know you guys are down at All Energy and got lots of other stuff to do. Andrew, is there something else that you wanted to say at the moment that you think I and our listeners should be aware of?
Oh, look, I think this is really a potential boon for a whole lot of regional communities for exactly the reasons that Emily's just been outlining. There will be new jobs and new skills for people in these kind of regions, and in many cases, lots of communities are saying, well, we want to have reasons for our young people to want to stay here, or go abroad and train and have jobs to come back to. So there's a whole lot of benefits there that I think we need to make a lot clearer. But again, I just come back to the fact that it's the shift to clean energy is much bigger than just the sum of its parts, particularly for those renewable energy regions that have concentrated development. And so unless we start treating the community engagement part as merely a collection of engagements around individual projects, it's going to be difficult to convince communities that there's something in it for them. So we really need to ramp up that level of engagement. I think when you look at the federal government and the money of tens of billions of dollars that are put towards the problem of encouraging investment in transmission, absolutely needed. But if bringing communities along with the transition is a key focus, and it's something that could be a make or break factor in whether we can meet our targets on time, then we need to really start investing in them. So that's, I think, the main message I would want to get across.
Cool. And Emily?
I couldn't agree more with Andrew. Andy's assessment of the underinvestment in the resourcing of coordinated community engagement. The multiplication of state significant development community reference groups should be a thing of the past. There's that need to bring communities along. But I actually just want to point to one thing that I haven't mentioned as something that became really apparent as very important to our community during this engagement SAND process. People don't want to see the destruction of remnant vegetation in the New England to accommodate these developments, and a nature positive outcome in the New England region particularly is something that our community has expressed very clearly they would like to see.
You mean more trout? Sorry, I'm just joking.
No, as you know, and I know you're joking, David, because you know that we are a specific bioregion that has multiple, threatened species, and what's left is really, really valuable. What's remnant, it was overcleared, there was eucalyptus dieback. What's left is incredibly valuable to the people that live there. And unfortunately, there's a bit of a land use conflict at times between where wind farms are sited and remnant woody vegetation. And there is a lack of confidence locally in the legislative framework that is supposed to protect our natural natural world, our different species, etc., in actually being effective in doing that, and with good reason. So that is a bit of a Gordian knot, I think, in terms of, at least in New South Wales, to understand how we can work at a bioregional level with the sort of offset system that we've got to ensure that what is very, very valuable is avoided, and that it's kind of, there's more natural capital after than what there was when it started.
Yep. The human footprint runs large, there's no doubt. And the same sort of issue, I'm sure, is something that the Queensland Conservation Council deals with all the time, where the transmission and the wind run along the ridges. And so there is that conflict all the time. But this conversation has convinced me yet again, and looking at it even through a theory lens, that we'd all be a lot happier if the regional communities were actually leading the charge, if they were the captains of this process, if they were the ones that had the plans and the ideas and the development, and just told the wind developers and the solar developments it's here and there, and the regional communities are actually going to be the biggest winners out of the process. And by taking charge, that's the way they can do it. But anyway, everyone has their own views on it. I'd like to say thanks very much to Andrew Bray and to Emily Sims for joining the Energy Insiders podcast today.